Hello, this is Sandra, and welcome to another Minute Lessons from the Torah. So, before we get started, I must confess that this week's lesson is going to be longer than a minute, even longer than 2 minutes. But there's just so much cool stuff that I really want to talk about. So sit back and relax, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson. On Sunday, as we were entering this week's Torah portion of Tisa, we celebrated the holiday of Purim. Purim is fun, lighthearted, and lacks seriousness. And Tisa has sober and somber themes where the Israelites commit the gravest sin of idolatry. Purim is a day of fun, joy, and feasting, a holiday for sending gifts to one another, and our rabbis have even declared that we are kind of obligated to become somewhat inebriated on that day. A behavior that would not be tolerated all year long is encouraged on Purim. The major events of the Parsha are troubling. Moses has been on top of the mountain for a long time, and the people are anxious and worried that Moses will not return. So they make and worship a golden calf and dance around it and have a big old party. When Moses returns, he witnesses this shameful scene and becomes enraged. He throws the tablets containing the 10 Commandments from his hands and shattering them. He then directs the Levites to grab their swords and slay brother, neighbor, and kin. The Torah says that some 3,000 people were killed that day because of the sin of the golden calf. Now that's some heavy stuff to read next to Purim. But there was a real gem in this week's Parsha. The last thing that God says to Moses before he heads down the mountain is a set of verses that has become one of our most beloved prayers. God says, V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat l'dor tambarit olam. The Israelite people shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as a covenant for all time. The prayer goes on to say that keeping the Sabbath shall be a sign for all time between me and the people of Israel. For in 6 days God made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day God ceased from work and was refreshed. God declares to Moses that Jews shall keep the Sabbath as our day of rest. God then says that observing the Sabbath is a sign of our bond with God. By keeping Shabbat, we are striving to be holy as God is holy. We imitate God's creation of the universe, creating, working for 6 days, then stopping to rest and refresh our souls on the 7th day. Back in Genesis, we learned God blessed the Sabbath day and called it holy. The first thing that God sanctified was Shabbat. God made it holy time. But it is here in this week's portion of Exodus that God declares our observance of this holy time of Shabbat as a sign of our covenant with God. Shabbat is a covenant between us and God. When we keep Shabbat, whatever that means to us as modern Jews, we reenact that covenant with God on Mount Sinai. And every week we get to renew that covenant with God. And we pause to notice the sacredness of creation. And maybe every Shabbat is an antidote to the sin of the golden calf. When we created the golden calf, we were anxious and nervous that Moses would not return. So we put our faith in something we could see and touch. Now, every week, we get to remind ourselves that our relationship still exists with God, even when we can't see it. Thank you for listening to this podcast. And if you like this podcast, please leave a review. All right, have a great week.